thank you very much for coming along and joining us this evening. We're going to continue, in a way, our thinking about Boston and sea level, but this time look a little bit more precisely at Boston, not just at the generic problems that are going to happen to the Northeast. You may recall that we pursued this in reference to New York in the first instance, and in fact we started out with thinking about what was happening down in New York by way of re-envisioning their circumstance, their relationship to the sea. So as we reviewed Boston by the sea, we were keeping in mind that it's the whole coastal future of New York City, Boston, Cambridge, in fact the whole Northeast that's involved here. At the time we looked in particular at why they had started to do this in 2009 in New York. There's actually a pretty interesting reason, and it has to do with an anniversary that they had down there, which we can recall a bit from an effort that they had on their own television at the time. And in fact, we saw it up here because it was reproduced by the Discovery Channel in that program of History International. You can pick it up from time to time. It's rebroadcast on a pretty regular basis. And I'd urge you to look at the whole piece. But just to refresh our memory as to what it was about, let's take a look at this. It's from a film they did on New York City and reminded us 2009 was a special year for them.
2009 marks the 400th anniversary of the discovery of New York Harbor by Henry Hudson. As the city heads into the future, how will it meet the challenges of the 21st century? Many experts warn that because of global warming, sea levels are rising, and Manhattan's low elevation puts it at risk.
Lower Manhattan right now is right at sea level. If people are going to continue to work and live in Lower Manhattan with 1 to 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise from global warming in the coming decades, they're going to have to live and work behind levees. There's no way around it. And it's going to start to look like New Orleans. That world, rapidly on its way, arriving largely in our lifetime, will look nothing at all like the planet we now inhabit. Nothing.
Well, that's a pretty sober statement right there. That world, already rapidly on its way, will look nothing like the world we have inhabited. Nothing. And he says it'll rapidly arrive, in fact, during most of our lifetimes. Well, in fact, it won't probably be in my lifetime, because I'm near 65 at this point, but the lifetime of any student these days, it will arrive. By 2050, I'll be 104 and probably won't be around, but a lot of students will be. And for that reason, the envisioning what's coming down the pike well within their lifetimes is well worth it. It's actually a very important effort at this point, and why New York engaged in this effort to take it beyond just the question of what's known by the experts or even by the weathermen or the like, and started to look in effect at the weather of the future, heat waves, extreme storms, and other scenes from the climate change challenged and changed planet. They began to envisage New York largely underwater, at least important sectors of it. And you'll recall that Barry Bergdahl up at the Museum of Modern Art was the one that has in effect brought together a lot of architects and engineers to think about the new interface with the ocean. And it was Bill Blakemore, the reporter from ABC News, who covered this story. So the imagination was engaged of New Yorkers as they were drawn into museums. Well, here in Boston, we're very fortunate, too, that in the last few weeks, in fact, over the course of the whole summer, WBUR, one of our news media here in the city, one of the major ones, has put out a series which they call Looking Out, a new view of Boston Harbor, or down here, a new view of the Boston Harbor, looking out. It's an interesting shift in emphasis, but you get the idea. They're going to look at the course of the summer. They're going to look at Boston Harbor, and it started on June 24th, was updated last on August 26th, so it's quite a series They, in fact, looked at the walkways around the harbor and what it means to many people, including fishermen, lobstermen, and the like, and its kind of place in the social structure of Boston. It was a very instructive series. It's all up online, and I urge you to go and look at the whole series when you get a chance. But there's another meaning to the new view of Boston Harbor and a new understanding of the term looking out. If you look at it in these terms, Boston Harbor, look out. Boston Harbor, look out. Why? Well, the last of the 10 in their series made it clear why. Why Boston Harbor? Why do you have to look out? Well, because take a look. These are largely the islands in the middle of Boston Harbor. And the title of their last in the series was Global Warming Tops Harbor Challenges. As you see, many see global warming as the biggest threat to Boston Harbor. This is a report by Fred Tees and Fred Ties of BUR, and it's worth listening to in detail. He's the person who's been covering this for them, not just this year, but over a series of years, as we'll see. But let's listen to it, see how he formulated the material.
NPR News Station. Coming up in about 6 minutes on WBUR's Morning Edition, we conclude our series on Boston Harbor with a look at some of the future challenges facing the harbor and its islands. This is WBUR, Boston's NPR News Station. Good morning. I'm Deborah Becker, in for Bob Oakes.
I really don't have that close of a connection to the harbor.
It's nice. I mean, you know, it's one of the good places to come.
It's in the air.
Every Thursday morning, all summer, we've been taking you to Boston Harbor with stories of its past and present in a series we're calling Looking Out, a New View of Boston Harbor.
Okay, that's it. Looking Out, a New View of Boston Harbor. Well, there's also Look Out, a new view of Boston Harbor that ought to start to be taken into account from what we know in New York, right? It'll be interesting to see the extent to which the Bostonians have caught up with the issues that are clearly now expressed in New York City.
We've taken you swimming and fishing and told you other stories of people enjoying the waters around Boston. This morning, WBUR's Fred Tice ends our series with a look at the harbor's future and the challenges it faces.
The big challenge is global warming.
Okay, there's no ambiguity there. No ambiguity at all. The big challenge is global warming. First sentence of Fred Tice on this, the local reporter who's put together the concluding segment.
One report finds that of all the cities in the U.S., only 3, Miami, New York, and New Orleans, are at greater risk of increasing storm surges than Boston.
Ooh, that's very sobering. Only 3 are at greater risk. We knew about Miami, we knew about New Orleans, and New York. Miami, New York, New Orleans, at greater risk than Boston. Boston is number 4. This is very sobering. So does the report reflect that sense of urgency further on? Let's see.
This is a really serious matter.
Pat Brandis is executive director of the Barr Foundation.
And the harbor is, of course, the gateway to these storms and the surges. So there are all kinds of plans being dreamt up at the moment of big gates being put across the islands to protect us from these kind of storm surges.
Okay, well, Pat Brandis of the Boston Foundation apparently does see the challenge here, and she's talking about these kinds of plans that are being drawn up to connect the islands to protect us from these kinds of storm surges. This has been referred to as defending Boston from the sea, and it's something that we need to look into in greater detail. Planners start envisioning a more waterproof city. Now that's an interesting formulation in itself. A waterproof city on the water. A waterproof city where if you create a barrier like this, in effect you're creating a basin which is below sea level and a sea level out here which is rising. You can ask yourself, how sustainable is that in the long run? Well, this hasn't just started. In fact, there's a major report that already exists, and it was published 6 years ago back in August of 2004, a full year before the Katrina catastrophe hit in New Orleans. It's called Climate's Long-Term Impacts on Metropolitan Boston, and it warned then, 6 years ago, that we were in deep trouble. The person who looked into it at great length was Paul Kirshen. He's a bit of the hero of this story, in a way, if there are any heroes. And it was reported on by none other than Fred Tice of BUR back in February of 2005. Listen to Fred's report at that time. Let's see if we can call it up here.
Boston is the focus of a first-ever report out today looking at the possible impact of global warming on a major U.S. city. The research, funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, was conducted by scientists at Tufts, Boston University, and the University of Maryland. WBUR's Fred Tice has details.
The study assumes the climate change scenarios used by the U.S. National Assessment of Climate Change, which relies on models that predict that by 2100, the average temperature would have risen by 7 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. An average increase of 7 degrees would give Boston a climate like Richmond, Virginia. 10 degrees would make it like Atlanta. The same models predict that sea levels would rise by 1 foot by 2050, and that's where most of the damage comes. Paul Kirshen is research professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University.
Okay, this is the Paul Kirshen we're referring to. At the time, he was in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University, and he's the one who was the lead author and investigator on this study.
And one of the authors of the study.
One of the things we're investigating in this study is the impact of coastal storm surges on flooding in metropolitan Boston. And one of the storms we're particularly interested in is the so-called 100-year storm. And this is, for example, the 100-year storm is what the blizzard of '78 was.
The blizzard of '78 caused a tremendous amount of coastal flooding. With the present climate, the statistical probability of a blizzard of '78 is once in 100 years. And in fact, there hasn't been another storm in the past century with coastal flooding as bad as that one. But if sea levels rise a foot by 2050, Boston can expect coastal flooding on the magnitude of the blizzard of '78 every 10 years.
Okay, now that's the interesting part that Paul made again and again as a point, namely that what we thought of as the 100-year flood, and most engineers will engineer an infrastructure for the 100-year event, the 100-year drought, the 100-year flood, is in fact going to change. It's going to become an every 10-year event if the climate changes proceed at the current rate.
Another way to look at it is to look at the Charles River Dam.
The dam at the Charles River, which separates the Charles River from Boston Harbor. The elevation of that dam, we just found out, is only 2 feet below the present 100-year storm. And under climate change, we can certainly expect at least 2 feet of sea level rise. So that means that storm will be 2 feet higher than it is now, which means it actually overtopped that dam from the seaward side.
Which means that by 2100, when sea levels are expected to rise by 2 feet, the Back Bay, MIT, and Kendall Square can expect it to be flooded every 10 years. All that flooding would mean lots of property damage, but it also means people would be stuck in traffic more.
Now, this is what, in fact, we put up on the web at the Cambridge Climate Research Associates under the title that the Boston Globe gave it, Boston in 100 Years. Well, this is a little deceptive in the sense that it's not what Boston's going to look like in 100 years. It's what a 100-year flood would make Boston look like. You can go to the Cambridge Climate Research website and go over to the left-hand corner and take a click on this, and you'll get to a series of pictures that emerged, in effect, from Paul Kirshen's study. He and his colleagues put this together with the associates down in Rhode Island, Narragansett, Rhode Island. And it's really quite a sobering series of pictures that you ought to look at. You can see what the current circumstance is and look at what their assumptions are going into this model. All models are a function of the assumptions put into them and then the data brought to it. So look at both those things. Applied Systems Associate of Narragansett, Rhode Island, simulated the effects on Boston of 100 years of sea level rise of what they called sea level rise of 15 inches at the same time that Boston is subsiding 6 inches. Then they took the information from MassGIS, the Massachusetts Geographic Information Systems, data repositories on water levels, and they worked with Google Earth to come up with these flood potentials. Now, you need to understand how this works, because it's a crucial set of variables, and someone will always come along and say, oh no, you forgot this, oh no, you forgot that. Several things are happening at once. There's high tide and low tide, right? High tide and low tide. High tide, low tide. There's an average between them. So there's an average tidal level. There's an average high tide. There's actually an average low tide, too. But with rising sea level, what's going to happen is that whole average, that range of variation between high tide and low tide, is going to increase, right? Simple enough. But it's not so simple when you think, on the other hand, the Earth itself, which is part of what sea level measures, is actually sinking. Subsiding is the word they use. Geologists refer to the subsidence of a site. New Orleans is subsiding. New York is subsiding. Boston is subsiding. So Boston's subsiding at the same time that the average sea levels are going up. Now, what you have to then calculate into it is, on top of the averages, is the storm surge. What happens if you have a storm that hits at the same time as high tide? And it's a category 1, 2, or 3, 4 or 5 hurricane. Suppose it's a 3, 4, or 5 hurricane at the same time as an average high tide that's higher, and the Earth has started to sink. When you start to interact these various kinds of models, these scenarios, they give you a range. What would be the low probability, what are the high probabilities, and what are the likely probabilities? This is what that whole series of pictures and models gets us to think about. And what's sobering about it all is that there is no precise prediction. Don't kid yourself. You can get these kinds of images of flood potential, and you can draw very nice diagrams about them, but no one has a key to exactly what's going to happen. On a northeaster, for example, is already high tide that's average. It's a lot higher than the average high tide. It may be 2.5 feet higher than the average high tide. At the same time, the land is settling, and if what happens up here, if you get a mid-range predicted in global warming of increased storm surge from both increasingly severe weather and a raise in the level of the tides, you're going to have an extraordinary situation where any known infrastructure engineered at these levels is going to be overtopped. And this is what happens in Boston. This is an example of high tide today, higher than usual tide. A northeastern with high tide already creates problems for the financial district and for Chelsea and Bennington Streets on the low-lying areas. Okay, that's already today, right? But what happens if you get the larger situation, or a Category 2 hurricane at high tide overtops the Charles River Dam, and you run into basically all of this area starts to become flooded in a very dramatic way. There's the Charles River Dam. Okay, what does it start looking like? Well, the back bay becomes like Venice in one sense, that you need gondolas to get around between the streets. After all, it's all filled. But this goes all the way up to Harvard. This is not confined there. In fact, if you look at the institutions involved, MIT is flooded, Boston University, Back Bay, Harvard Science Museum itself is going to be in danger. It's right there next to the Charles Street Dam. And this is why people are beginning to pay attention to this in a big way. Bud Riss talked about it in this recent
To wrap
series.
up our series on Boston Harbor, we went to the New England Aquarium. Standing just outside the aquarium on the waterfront, we spoke with Bud Riss, President and CEO of the aquarium, and Vivian Lee, Executive Director of the Boston Harbor Association. Okay, now we're standing here on a very foggy, dismal kind of day here on the water, but it's very nice. The aquarium is behind us. The harbor walk is in front of us, and if we hear any yells that sound like a man moaning, those are actually seals, right, Bud?
Those are seals, and it's because they're hungry. They're not really moaning, but their feeding time is in about 4 minutes. There you go. There's one of them right there.
Well, we're not here to talk about seals today. We're actually here to talk about the harbor. We're concluding our series on the Boston Harbor at WBUR, and we want to talk about the harbor's future and some of the challenges for the harbor in the near future. What do you think is one of the biggest obstacles facing the harbor?
Well, you know, I think one of the challenges ahead is rising seas, and this is a consequence of climate change. Most people think it's related to melting ice caps, and that actually isn't the case, at least yet. The principal causes right now of sea level rise are what's called thermal expansion of the ocean, and that means as water warms, as it has begun to warm over the last several decades, it expands. And of course, if you warm the entire oceans, that water has to go somewhere, and it's going to go up. The second cause is melting of glaciers inland here throughout the United States, also all over the world, in Europe, the Himalayas, and elsewhere, and that contributes more water draining off into the oceans. So we're already experiencing some of that. The seas are rising at about 3 millimeters a year, 30 millimeters a decade. There's our friendly seal again, who comes from a very cold climate. And then in the future, if the ice caps in Greenland and Antarctica also melt, that will add significantly to sea level rise.
Okay, well, Bud is very clear and very, in effect, on top of the issue here. It's not going to be a mystery to him that this is occurring, but has the public gotten to thinking about what this, in fact, is going to mean for that whole area around the aquarium? At this point, the aquarium on the maps is going to be one of the areas, it's listed as J down here, that's going to be underwater. Well, you can see why he started to think about it, because all of what we call the Greenway, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, and all of this area along the wharf is going to be threatened. Now, this is where we need some imagination. Planners are starting to envisage a more waterproof city, but can we make it waterproof if sea level itself is rising? Now, there are a lot of people interested in this and starting to think about it, and the Boston Harbor Association is one of them. But you can see all the other institutions that could get involved. They're going to be affected very directly if this kind of scenario develops. And as the ancient Chinese proverb has it, if you do not change direction, you will probably end up where you were headed. This is where we're headed at this point. We've got to start imagining new alternatives, and we may have to do the kind of thing that Barry Bergdahl down in New York did at the Museum of Modern Art, and that is re-envision ways in which we should think about the harbor altogether. We've got plenty of museums in this part of the world, the Institute of Contemporary Art, Museum of Science, Children's Museum, Museum of Fine Arts itself, along with the Boston Harbor Association, New England Aquarium, and numerous other institutions. And if you look at them, they're all right on sea level. This is the Institute of Contemporary Art. Here's the Museum of Science. There's the Children's Museum, right on the piers. And right back here is the Muddy River. And they're just putting a new addition here in the Museum of Fine Art. Perhaps we should devote some of these new additions and maybe get Bill Blakemore to come up to Boston and think with us about reviewing Boston by the sea, reimagining what's going to happen, because it's not going to, in effect, be automatic. This is something that we have to sit down and think through as a community together. We've got the assets to think it through and a lot of motivated people to do so. But we need to start.